Hi, it's JillyBean from JillyBean Pottery, and I wanted to welcome you back to my studio. Today we're going to talk about sanding. So in my last video I talked to you about not using water to smooth work because it leaves things rough. And the reason for that, just to revisit, is that it removes soft particles of clay. And so in most clay there is grog and sand mixed in for strength, and these are materials that are previously fired, and because they're previously fired, when they don't shrink. So clay shrinks. Those of you who've worked with clay will know. Those of you who don't, welcome to the realities of clay. It shrinks 3 times. It shrinks when it's drying, it shrinks in its first fire, and it shrinks again in the last fire. And all those fine particles don't shrink because they're pre-fired. So they come to the forefront. So we don't help that in any way, shape, or form by using water beforehand, but we still feel some of them. If you've ever scratched a table surface or whatever, a desk or something like that with a piece, you're subject to that grog and grit of there. So this, I wanted to talk to you about sanding, and I actually have a great blog post that goes in more detail about do you believe in sanding? I do. And I'm going to talk to you about when you should sand, how to sand safely from a health perspective, and how to have fun with the whole thing. So, great. Welcome to sanding. First, there's 3 states of clay we're going to refer to. One is greenware, which is a piece that has not been fired at all, but is bone dry, so it has no moisture left whatsoever. It's before the bisque firing. Some people will sand them. I do not, because it's very fragile. Using greenware and handling it, you can break it, so I don't bother. So I do the compression that I talked to at leather hard in the last video, but I do not sand it greenware. So I'm going to be showing you and actually sanding a bisqueware and a finished piece for you. This will be a weird demo because normally when I do a demo like this and I've taught before, I hand the piece around so people can feel it and how the difference. So you're just gonna have to take my word for it that it'll be better. So sorry about that. So the first is bisque. Why do you sand a bisque? I sand a bisque only if there's something that I missed at the wet clay stage that could become sharp and then therefore hard to sand later. And if you look at this one, I don't know how you can see that. You can see my name, signature, and then this little spot right there. There's a little like piece of clay, and then my signature you can kind of see right here is a little bit rough. I tend to be a little sloppy when I do that. So these are both times when I would sand. I would not sand for other reasons though. You know, all that grit or anything that might come to the surface hasn't come to the surface yet. It's not going to be till after the finished work stage. But what I go after are things like those 2 parts I pointed out, which are, you know, anything that is going to be problematic to sand at the finished work stage. And once it's fully fired, bisque, for those of you who don't know, is the first firing a piece goes through. It's still, you can tell it's fired, but it's still porous and fragile. And so if you don't actually fire the clay the rest of the way, it can deteriorate and crumble over time. But the reason why we do it is it's no longer fragile. I can handle it, you know, without issue. I can toss it around. I wouldn't recommend that. It might break. But you can do those kinds of things. And then, but it's still porous, it sucks up the glaze. And so that's a good thing. That's why we do it. But because it's still soft, right? Soft, in comparison to a fully fired piece, we can sand like that. All the problems that would be a pain in the ass to sand, sorry for my language, to sand at the finished work stage. So that's what I go after. The other thing you could do if you really wanted to be crazy about it is if there's a piece that wasn't level. I make planters with 4 feet. 4 is never level, or it can be level, but 3 is always level. Anything more than that, you run the risk of it not being level. I've also sanded for levelness at this stage, but I can actually do it at the finished work stage. I just do it then. So that would be another reason why you might. So I'm going to go after these 2 things. Now, safety-wise, we're inside. I'm in my studio. It's a basement studio. I do not want to just go wild and sand for a couple of reasons. One, I'm going to get all this dust up into the air. It's going to be in the studio. I spend a lot of time mopping my studio to keep the dust down for, you know, health reasons, but also, you know, I don't want to track it. Upstairs I have special studio shoes that I wear. Only in my studio I leave them at the bottom of the stairs. You can kind of see the staircase behind me. So I, you know, help to minimize some of the tracking of the dust. The other reason, probably more important reason, is that it's not healthy for you to breathe all that dust in. Clay in its wet form is safe, but the dry form it's not. And so, you know, how do I sand this without kicking up dust? Well, one, I could go outside, right? It's dark right now. It's late at night, me doing this video. So, and I live in the mountains, so there was a bear, I think like last week, spotted in the neighborhood. I'm not going outside right now, okay? So I could go outside, I could wear a respirator and a mask, or I could wet sand. And wet sand is like the best solution in the entire world because you can sand without kicking up dust. It's wet. So I have with me pre-prepared a bowl of water. You want a bowl that obviously your pieces are going to fit into relatively easily. If I'm doing a lot of work and lots of different sizes, I'll get a whole bucket of water. And sometimes I still may do this if it's during the day and it's a nice day outside, just because sometimes the water gets everywhere, especially if I'm doing a lot of work. But if I'm not, you know, this is just fine. So the other thing that I have are sandpaper. And you can buy any kind of sandpaper that you want. In terms of brand, I get some of my sandpaper at the dollar store. I have no idea what brand it is. It's super cheap though. But you want to pay attention to the grit. So you can see here, this is a 220 sandpaper. This one is 150. And this one is 80. So you can see that. You want to pay attention to the grit of the sandpaper. A lot of times they'll come in packs like this one did with different grits. And then you also want to get sandpaper that is waterproof, because if we're going to be putting in water, we want it to be waterproof. And non-waterproof sandpaper, I've gotten it, I've been there, I've done that, it works. But the backing, it just falls apart. So you really do want that waterproof. It'll say on the packaging, sometimes there will be a water drop on the back. There's not on this one. Sometimes it'll say, like this one, it'll say waterproof on there. Sandpaper grit is by number. The lower the number, the coarser the grit. So I don't know how well you can see. Here is the difference. This is the 80 grit. This is the 220 grit. So you can see this one over here is way finer grit than this one over here. And why does that matter? Well, you can actually, when we get to the finished work stage, you can sand over a glazed surface. So one, you want to pay attention to grit because some grits will scratch the glaze and some won't. Two, the other thing is you can get your work super baby bottom smooth if you really want to. And what you do is you progressively go up in grit. So you start with a lower grit and then you slowly work your way up higher and it'll be nice and perfect. I'm not so strict with my sanding, but you can. Some people who do jewelry and things like that, they'll go up grits just to make sure that they have it nice and smooth against the skin. The other thing I have is scissors. You saw this piece here. I actually cut my sanding paper. I find it works better. This whole sheet is just too big for me to work with easily. Sometimes I'll cut it even smaller. I usually cut it in fourths, but sometimes I'll cut it even smaller just because I find it less wasteful and also easier to hold. So this is much easier than that whole sheet. The other thing I have is a sanding stone. You can see this. They come in different sizes. This is a sanding stick maybe. There's ones that are wider, and these are wonderful too. These are a porous sanding stone. You can see mine has been used. It wears down over time. The middle where my fingers are the thickest, it's wear down on both ends. And it's waterproof, so that's good too. This is for going after tougher stuff. Okay, so, and you can get this at any pottery supply store, Amazon, whatever. Okay, so, and then sandpaper, the same thing, hardware store, Lowe's, Home Depot. It's not special ceramic sandpaper, online, whatever, go for it. Okay, so, scissors, hopefully you have those at home. Water bowl, hopefully you had that at home. Okay, so I'm gonna sand this. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna dip it in the water. I don't need to get the whole piece wet because I'm just sanding part of it. You can see it's wet. I'm also for bisque sanding, I'm gonna use my coarsest grit, which is the 80. I'm gonna get that wet too. And with both of these wet, when I go to sand, I create a slurry on my sandpaper, and I create a little bit of a slurry here. You can kind of see that. And what that does is all the dust is trapped in the water. So all the things that we don't want are trapped, and all the things, you know, it's great. And then you just stick it back in the water, rinse it off, and then you're good. So I have, you know, all of these nice smooth surfaces, all those little things, you know, were gone. And I have all this dust trapped here. Same thing, I can rinse that off in the bowl of water, and voila, yay, no dust. So, okay, so that's a good example of bisque. And, you know, the other nice thing, you know, we skipped over greenware as a thing to sand, but, you know, the other thing is you can't get it wet. So you have to go outside, you have to kick up so much dust, it's really not healthy for you. So, bisque. At bisque. Okay. Now at the finished wear stage, this is a bear mug. At the finished wear stage, you know, you might have things that you can see at the bottom here, a little bit of that white, that's kiln wash. So you might have that. Anything that I missed in my bisque sanding, you can see I did a good job of my signature. I don't have anything sticking up. But you'll feel it's a little rough, not a lot. Now on this bottom surface here, I can use whatever grit I want. I can use 80, 220, whatever. If I want to go after, I use a lot of raw clay in my design. So this bear here, these lines, that's the raw clay. And obviously this darker, it's a cobalt. It looks black a lot of times in video, but it's cobalt. You know, it's smooth, you don't want to scratch that. So I'm going to get my mug wet. Same process, get it wet. And get your sandpaper. I'm going to use the 80 for the bottom. And I find that using the coarser grit gets some of the bigger stuff first, and then you can switch to a finer grit to refine it a little bit. But, you know, I find this easier to hold. I want to be careful when I'm doing this not to get to the, you know, glazed area. And I use my finger to kind of feel everything. Sometimes I'll rinse it off and then feel. Sorry. I'm like, it nose itches. Your nose ever itches. It's just, you have to do something. There's really no getting around it. Okay, so I've done that. Okay, so I'm rinsing that off. Now I'm going to take, this is my 220. I'm going to get that wet. And you can reuse these sanding sheets for other work. They last for a long time. And I'm just going to go over it again with the 220. And now it's super smooth. Some people will go to 400, then 600, then 800. There's even 1,000, I think, grit. I don't do that, but you can. You can if you really want to. Okay, now the other thing I'm going to do, I'm going to get the rest of this mug wet. Because this shows the bare clay with these bears, I'm going to sand them. Now because of the proximity to the glaze, I run the risk of scratching the glaze. So 200 or higher will not scratch the glaze. Okay? So it might take a little longer because I can't use the lower grit. But I find that I don't need a lot. I just need, you know, I spend a lot of time smoothing the sides of my work with a rubber rib, which compresses all those particles of clay. So this is just like a final touch, if you will. But you can see I am sanding, this is sandpaper, that's the mug, right over it. All right, you can see I have not scratched any of my glaze, nice and smooth. And you can't feel the bears, but the bears are nice and smooth now. So, you know, that's a really easy trick in solution. And I do that with all of my work that has that, because you don't want someone holding this mug and going like this and getting, you know, I mean, it's not going to hurt you, but it you know, you want it to feel comfortable and good for someone who's purchasing. So there's already enough, we're going to talk about this in a future video, you know, mug functionality and handle size and all that stuff. We'll talk about that in a future video, but you know, there's enough challenges with mugs. Mugs are like the ultimate thing almost, you know, right after teapots, or right before teapots even, you know, to get right. And so you don't want to add to that. So there you go, sanding. I did not use a sanding stone. I just saw it. This is for when you have something like, if that kiln wash hadn't come off easily with the sandpaper, this is what I would use. The other time that I would use this is if I hadn't sanded like my signature at bisque and I had forgotten and it was sharp here. This is gonna get it off, not the sandpaper. And it's just because, you know, if it's a little thicker, this, you know, would need to be needed. So same thing, just like with the sandpaper, you get it wet in the water, get the piece wet and use it. Works just like that. You can clean it off easily. So that's it. Sanding 101 in high speed. Goodbye. Thanks for joining me.